Welcome to our trailer episode of Leadership Language. We're excited to bring you this new podcast series where we deliver inspiring conversations with a broad range of leaders about the power of communication. We talk candidly to our guests about leadership styles, success, moments of learning, the uncomfortable situations, and courageous conversations that follow. Importantly, we discuss self-awareness and how vital it is for future success. I'm Dinah Bryant, Communications Manager at Specialists in Communications. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Sheena Ireland, our founder and Managing Director. Today, we'll chat about why we've created this new podcast series and what we hope it will achieve. Sheena is a passionate advocate for meaningful connection in leadership, public affairs, and advocacy. She believes that empathy underpins connection, and honest storytelling has the power to transform organisations and lives. Today we discuss leadership, why honest and empathetic communication is important, how truly listening can give you the edge, and, of course, why you should tune in for the many episodes we have planned. Grab a cuppa, sit back and discover more about our new Leadership Language podcast. Well, this is a very exciting interview for me to be doing. Good morning, Sheena. How are you?
Good, Dinah. How are you?
This is our trailer for the new Leadership Language podcast that Specialists in Communications has put together. Now, you're the Managing Director of Specialists in Communications. I'm one of your employees. And today we want to talk to you. It's a little bit weird, your employer interviewing you, but let's go with it. We want to talk to you about leadership language. How did you come up with the idea for leadership language, and why do you think it's an important podcast to be putting out there for people to listen to?
I think I've had this idea for quite a while, but there's nothing like a pandemic, bushfires, hail, and all of the things that 2020 has brought to bring this idea to life. And as you know, there's been a lot of discussions with you, and I've had a lot of discussions with some other people about how communication really is the greatest challenge for leaders across the globe. And this year we've seen the best examples of communication and we've seen the worst. And we've seen how communication can be sort of put in a corner. I know we've both worked in areas where communication can sometimes be the colouring in department rather than the strategic people who kind of get in at all levels. And particularly this year, we're learning how communication is actually integral for everything. It's how you talk to teams. It's how the interpersonal conversations you have. It's how you talk to your community. It's how you talk to your stakeholders. So communication is so far-reaching, and I think it's time we have some what we call courageous conversations to show people that communication is also about being raw, being honest, and having the courage to confront things that might be uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And I think if people look at the subject of our podcast, leadership language, we're not just necessarily talking about, you might hear the word leadership and you might think Prime Minister straight away. So, and obviously our Prime Minister has very much been in the spotlight this year, right from the start, from the get-go with the bushfires and now COVID. And that's a tough job. It's a tough gig to be a Prime Minister when you have a crisis, or in this case, crises in 1 year. But we're not just talking about people in positions of that calibre. We're talking about your boss or your coach, even family relationships where the leader, I guess, could be the parents. And at Specialists in Communications, we're all about communicating with empathy. But as you said, we also want to encourage people to have those courageous conversations, the ones that make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, the ones that are a little bit prickly. So I guess when you're looking for talent that we've interviewed for these podcasts, what sort of people are we looking for, and what sort of insights are we going to get along the way with these episodes?
We're looking right across our network and looking at people, like you said, who aren't just the typical leaders as in the heads of the organisations, or we've got a couple of CEOs who we admire greatly. But for me, it's anyone who I come into contact with who I've been able to have a really good discussion with, who is open to taking courage, to talking about the good and the bad of communication, talking about their uncomfortable moments, and really using those conversations to inspire and help teach others how to refine their own communication and even their own leadership language.
And what do you think makes a good leader, Sheena?
It's a really great question, Dinah. And, often, I work with a lot of leaders, and in particular, I do work with a lot of female leaders. And one thing I always say is there's no one leadership style. There's no good or bad. Well, I guess there is kind of good and bad, but there's no one leadership style that's best over the others. There's leaders who draw on their strengths, and there's leaders who are really self-aware, so they understand where they might have a strength, but where they also might have, and I'm going to take something from a guest we've got coming up in a couple of months, a shadow side. Self-awareness, I think, gives most leaders the skills they need to lead, because then they can go into any experience knowing how they can best deal with it, but also understanding where others are at, having empathy and all of those kind of things. So if anything, I'm going to say the best leadership skill that anyone can have is self-awareness.
What are the negatives or the drawbacks if you don't have that self-awareness, do you think?
The drawbacks, I think, often happen when we don't have self-awareness. Sometimes we can think we're going into a situation to get a certain, result, and we wonder why we're butting our heads against the wall, and we start to blame others for things not happening. We start to believe that all situations almost become one size fits all. And so with that lack of self-awareness, often we don't understand how to connect with others, and we can't tailor our communication to others. And so when we are self-aware, often we can see, again, where our strengths are, where we are challenged somewhat, and where we can gain some insight into others and what works and what doesn't work in terms of connecting with other people. And I guess summing that even up is it's the ability to not see everything as a one size fits all. I think self-awareness gives us a real insight into not just ourselves, but how others might work, how others might communicate. And so we can start to tailor things to different situations to get the best out of others and to get the best out of ourselves.
And when we talk about there is no one size fits all type of leadership, we're also sort of saying that you need to be adaptable in your leadership as well, don't you? And 2020 has proven that more than any other year.
Absolutely. Adaptability is key. And yeah, there's nothing like this year to show people that, more than any other year I've ever been through. And there's a danger in not being adaptable, because there are so many variables in every organisation, in every family, everything we go into when we look at communication. There are so many variables. So if we look for a one-size-fits-all solution, we can suddenly end up possibly connecting with one person and never connecting with another person. And so then we start to think there's something wrong with the person we're not connecting with, or something wrong with the people who are not connecting message. And it's just not true. When we have to connect with people, we need to recognise all of the variables that could be, again, having empathy with where that person is at. They may not have the same knowledge level, having empathy that they might have had a different experience, because we're all shaped by our own experiences. So essentially we are all different. Even if we think we've had a similar background, there are always going to be differences, because we are different humans, and that shapes our different unconscious bias as well. We can go into situations thinking that because I've done this before, it's going to be the same, and that can be quite dangerous. So that adaptability allows us to see where the variables are, and again, adapt in a different way, or make a decision that's better informed for the current situation, etc.
This podcast is called Leadership Language. So when we talk about communications, the language we use is also really, really important. And that's obviously something we're going to touch on in the episodes that come ahead as well.
Absolutely, it is. Language is so important. And, a lot of the times when I'm teaching effective communication, I always talk about the words we speak being probably 30% or so of what people take. There's tone and there's body language, but it doesn't mean that language isn't important. Language can be used to empower, and it can be used to disempower. And often when we're in stressful situations, or when we're working in organisations that a defensive angle is taken more often than not, we start to get in the habit of thinking that disempowering language is the way to go. And when we flip that and we start to look at how we can empower people, we get the best out of people, and we usually get the best results. So language is so important from an empowerment and a disempowerment point of view. It's also vital, when we look at cultural awareness. There's a lot of conversations now around cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. And a lot of that comes down to the way we go into situations and even the language we're using. It's really important that we learn more more about language and what that means for other people in all areas. So, yeah, language is key, and we're going to have some really exciting conversations on that.
And it's really timely given there are a lot of elections occurring as we currently speak. I think a lot of people may have started watching the debates that are occurring in the United States at the moment for the presidential leadership. And I think when it comes to election time, some people become really disheartened with some of the politicians that they're watching, largely because of the language that they're using as part of their leadership. Do you think that's a fair call?
I do think it's a fair call, actually. You know, there is a disappointment when people will kind of go in that element of going, well, we have to slam other people and we have to completely just disagree. And by disagreeing, instead of having a conversation, instead of being courageous and confronting the issue, we have to slam the issue, or even more disappointing is slam the person, which I just find, again, that disappoints me a lot, because I think we should never debate the person. We debate the issue. And a real debate is about having the courage to talk about the issue and empathise with where someone else is coming. Again, we go back to that recognising difference, recognising different perspectives, because to me, and me, I love politics, and you're a bit the same. We have some great politics chats, and that is around recognising diverse perspectives. And when it's reduced to this, I guess, negative language and disempowering language, it doesn't foster diverse perspectives. And I think as a consumer, or I think as, a constituent, and all of those kind of things, you can witness politicians throwing around insults and negative language, and you can actually feel disempowered if your point of view is different to theirs, and you can almost then be afraid to put your point of view forward. The more we allow people to have diverse perspectives and we ask more questions like, oh, can you tell me more about that? The more we can understand where people are coming from, we can have the empathy, and we can actually have real courageous communications that empower most people, if not all.
Another thing that we say is key when it comes to leadership, when it comes to communication, is the power of listening. And I know that I've listened to some of our episodes that are coming up, and some of our beautiful people that we've interviewed for this podcast, they all agree that listening is key to being a leader. Tell us a little bit about how you see the importance of listening in all of the roles that you play. And you play a lot of leadership roles, particularly in your volunteer work as well. Listening's
a superpower, and it's definitely the most fundamental skill around communication, and talk a lot about in this fast-paced world that we're in, particularly in this electronic world, let's be honest, where conversations are much shorter and people are not really looking deep for information. People make a lot of assumptions. The less time we have, I think, the more assumptions we make, because we think that it's going to be quicker and easier to do something. But when we make a lot of assumptions and we don't listen and we don't ask questions and listen some more, we can get it wrong. And so listening means that we're not thinking ahead at what we have to say next. And how many people, and I know I've done this before many times in my career, sat in a meeting writing notes and also only half listening because I've got something on my mind that I want to say and I want to get across. And what it means is when you're doing that, you're not fully listening, you're not actively listening, and you're not really in the conversation because you miss important elements. And I do say that, one of the most valuable things I've ever done is become a Lifeline crisis supporter, because you can only listen. I mean, you support and you help someone in their time of need, but you can't make any assumptions when you're talking to someone on the phone and it's an anonymous situation and you know nothing about the background. And so you actually have to listen without assumption. You listen without judgment. You listen with unconditional positive regard. And that is when you can have a true and real conversation. And I really want to emphasize the unconditional positive regard, because something that we do a lot these days, I'll be honest, is I think because we are so busy, we make all these judgments. We often go into a situation and we question why people are saying something, or we jump to an assumption about why someone has said or done something without unconditional positive regard. When someone says something and we don't agree with it, or we feel offended about it, if we can take a step back and go, okay, with my unconditional regard, what could be happening for that person? What could be behind it? What questions can I ask to go deeper about that instead of just tuning out? You can actually have quite a good conversation. And it's not always going to have a very positive outcome, but it can be better than just shutting conversation down or shutting out a situation because you've jumped to an assumption and a judgment. So I know that's a long answer, but, listening...
No, but it's important.
Yeah, listening to me is just such a vital thing to do. And I always say accompanied with listening is questions. Instead of jumping to a judgment or trying to tell a story that you've done that you think, this person might want to hear, maybe just sitting back and going, oh, that's really interesting. Can you tell me more? Or, oh, I've never thought about it that way. Can you tell me more? And then you get a chance to listen even more and understand. And it's something at Specialists in Communications we are adamant about. We have some really long-term clients, and I love that because we can listen to them sort of every day and get to know them more and be able to advise and speak for them. But the reality is we never advise until we listen. So if someone comes to us and they ask for something, we make it our point to say that we need to talk for a while and we need to listen and we need to research, because without understanding the objectives, the audience and everything about that business and that person, we can't provide advice. Because and it goes back to what we were saying before, communication is not one size fits all. And so if we were to give a strategy that we're giving to someone else, to a different organisation, it may not fit their needs because they're a different person, they have different objectives and they have a different audience. So listening underpins everything we do.
It's very much about living in the moment, isn't it? And not wanting those quick wins all the time. I think if you're in a leadership position, sometimes you really want to get those quick wins on the board, but getting the quick wins on the board doesn't sustain your leadership.
Yes, it's so true, isn't it? It's the whole robbing Peter to pay Paul or whatever they say, You might get that quick gratification from a quick win, but what are you doing for the long term, and what are you jeopardising in the long time, if not for your own career, but for your own team and all of those kind of things as well. So,
and what do you stand for?
Absolutely. And that's a really important one too. And we've talked a lot about values driving communication. And in any organisation, essentially it's the values that are the framework for communication. It's in any personal situation, it's usually your values that are your framework for communication. It's what do you stand for? What do you rest on? All of those kind of things.
Absolutely, absolutely. The last question I have for you is, what are you hoping our listeners, and we hope we're going to have lots of listeners out there that absolutely love this podcast, but what are you hoping that they're going to take away from each episode that we put out there? We're doing it because we really want to help people. We want to engage people. We want to explain and show to people how important communications really is and how important communications is within leadership. What pearls of wisdom do you think people are going to take away from these podcasts?
I hope in some ways it challenges people to think a different way, because I think when we are challenged, we start to get even more self-aware and we can further develop our communication, because we don't just get more self-aware, we see the world through someone else's lens, and so we can start to gain more awareness of others. So that challenge, I think, is something I hope people will take away. Another point, I think, is people will come away from these conversations realising that we are all human, and no matter what point you get to, I mean, we've got CEOs, we've got, heads of universities, we've also got other communicators working across government and across business, and we've got people working in business, parents, everyone. And I think what I really want people to know is that we are all human, and no matter what position you get to, you don't necessarily get it right all the time. And that's okay, because we can always learn from those situations. We can learn from others. And it's how we respond when we don't get it right that actually matters probably a bit more. And it's really important to acknowledge when we have made a mistake, or we have said something that might have offended someone, or, we've made someone not feel great. It's really important to acknowledge that and respond appropriately, again, with empathy and all of those things. And so I want people to know that it's okay, we are human, but we can always do better as well. So I guess that comes into we're human, but I also want this podcast to challenge people to learn about diverse perspectives and learn more about communication.
Absolutely. And never think that you've got to the top and you don't need to adapt or change, because if 2020 has taught us anything, I mean, if you asked the Prime Minister of this country right now, if he thought towards the end of last year that he would have to deal with bushfires and a global pandemic, I'm pretty sure the response would have been, no, that's never going to happen in my lifetime.
It's so true, isn't it? And, you know, we can criticise, we can talk about things, but at the end of the day, no one's ever gone through the amount that's happened this year. And everyone will do the best they can with what they've got at the time. And I think this year has shown that there's a lot of people who are doing their best. And yes, we can always learn and be better, but people are really working hard and doing their best. And the flip side of that is we need to look at the communication with ourselves as well, because I also think this year, and, you know, I don't know what the Prime Minister's thinking, I would love to know that, but I imagine there's been moments that there would have to be the self-doubt and there would be the fear and all of those things, because it's a huge responsibility. And then the communication with ourselves becomes important, because there is self-talk, particularly when we have self-doubt and all of those kind of things, and we need to be conscious of that. We need to be conscious of the way we communicate with ourselves as well, because that does also shape us as a leader, and it supports us, again, thriving in those positions, or sometimes not. So self-talk, self-communication is also a vital thing, particularly through the year that has been.
This has been a lovely chat, always a lovely chat, and we're very excited. It's been a long time in the making, this podcast series. We hope that everybody out there is going to enjoy it. Sheena, thanks for chatting with me today. This is our official first kind of episode. I guess we're calling it a trailer, not episode 1, but we really want everybody to tune in, and I just thank you for your time today, and we just can't wait to hear the feedback, can we?
Indeed. I'm so excited. Thank you, Dinah. This has been such an amazing team effort, and I can't wait for people to hear more.
Beautiful. Well, until that first episode is played in a couple of weeks' time, that's it from us, and we really hope you enjoy what we're going to produce for you in the coming months ahead. Thanks for joining us for our trailer episode of our new Leadership Language podcast. We hope you've been inspired and you'll join us next fortnight for our official first episode. We'd love you to tune in when we'll be speaking to Carrie Leeson, CEO of Lifeline Canberra. Carrie has some amazing leadership advice and discusses the importance of listening, adapting, and being authentic. Until next time, thanks for joining us for Leadership Language.